He paid for silence and traded it for a lullaby. Reed Langston had chosen 2A on the morning flight for its cocoon, noise-canceling hum, polished coffee, documents stacked with the precision of a surgeon's tray. 10 minutes after takeoff, the hush he'd purchased unraveled like a thread. A woman's voice slipped through the curtain to Coach. Soft, steady, not English. Spanish, his mind supplied a beat later. Not a performance. A lullaby, offered to a fevered child with the same economy he used to speak to boards and ministers. A rowmate cleared his throat. An attendant's trolley clinked by. The song kept its shape. Reed looked down at a paragraph about dosing protocols and realized he hadn't absorbed a single word. The next hint came disguised as embarrassment. "Would you like the farfalle?" the attendant asked a passenger. The same voice from Coach, still gentle, answered without looking up. "Farfalle?" Not a correction so much as a tiny realignment, like straightening a picture frame as you pass it. He thought of algorithmic drift, how the smallest mislabeling can multiply into catastrophe. He pressed the call button. "Is there a reason I can't sit in row 18? He asked when the attendant arrived. She blinked. Sir, that's Coach." "I know," he said, already closing his laptop. "I'd like to change seats." 2 rows back from the curtain, the world looked different. Elbows nearer, heat human rather than recirculated, sentences stitched from more than one country. The woman in 18F held a sleeping boy, his damp curls pressed to her collarbone. She didn't glance up as Reed settled into the middle seat beside her. He didn't speak. 3 minutes later, she began humming again, switching mid-verse into French, the vowel music clean and unpretentious. He found himself listening for how she ended each line, not with flourish, but certainty, like a sentence that has chosen its period. Turbulence loosened the overhead bins. The boy stirred, whimpered. She soothed him, this time in Turkish. Reed turned then, not because of the language, he had translators for that, but because even in a word he didn't understand, he could hear what mattered, when someone says the right thing and means it. She nodded, acknowledging the glance without inviting conversation. He waited until the seatbelt sign went off, then held out a sheaf of pages. "Istanbul," he said. "Phase 2 clinical trial. English to Turkish. Something reads wrong." Her right hand was looped around the boy. She took the packet with her left, the same hand that had been smoothing his hair. Her eyes didn't skim. They landed. A pen appeared from nowhere, and she circled a line in the consent summary. "This word signals medication," she said softly. "Your sentence is describing treatment. If you keep it, you imply a pill where the context is a multi-visit therapy. It's not a big error on paper. In a room with anxious families, it becomes a promise you can't keep." 15 seconds, he thought. 15 seconds to pick the lock he couldn't. "You studied Turkish," he said. "I studied language," she answered. "Turkish came with a few others." "How many?" 7. She said it the way some people say their shoe size. He let the silence do the work he usually assigned to questions. She filled in what mattered without prompting. "Camille," she said, inclining her head. "My son is Noah." "Reed," he replied. He had never introduced himself mid-air to anyone who didn't already know him. "Turkish is beautiful," she added, almost to herself. "It pays you back if you listen long enough." He looked at the boy again. Fever flush had receded to the gentle pink of sleep. "Your lullaby," he said, nodding toward the hush between them. "Spanish?" "My mother's," she said. "She used to say the night listens to Spanish better than the day." The captain announced their descent. The cabin became a tangle of buckles and plastic cups. Reed slid the papers back into their folder, slower than necessary. It gave him time to think about the meeting waiting in Boston. 10 a.m. Half the attendees flying in from 3 continents, 4 languages planned, a 5th always ready to ambush. He usually preferred orchestration from the edge of the stage. Today he wanted a different instrument. "I have a meeting in the morning," he said without preamble. "We'll be asking regulators and hospital partners to trust a trial that scares them for reasons they can't say out loud. There's French in the legal structure, German across procurement, and English that means different things to everyone in the room. I need someone who hears what people think they said." Her eyebrows lifted a millimeter. She didn't look at him. She looked at the child. That sounds like 40 hours of work disguised as 90 minutes. It's not a job, he said. It's a seat at the table. If you come and it isn't for you, you can stand up and leave at any time. He saw the flash of calculation he respected in the people who never pretended not to count. Childcare, transit, clothing. The muscle memory required to walk into a room that had never pictured you in it. He didn't sweeten the offer. He handed her a card. There was no title on it, only a hotel name in a time. Bring him, Reed added, a beat late, as if the thought had only now made it to the front of his mouth. We'll arrange care on site. He didn't explain how he knew, and she didn't ask how he could. They landed into a Boston afternoon that had sharpened itself on cold glass. On the jet bridge, the line hiccuped to a stop, the way crowds do when someone realizes the rest of their life might be waiting at the top of the stairs. A woman with silver hair in front of them turned around and said, in Italian, "I haven't heard that lullaby since Naples." Camille replied in the same language. 2 sentences, a smile hiding in them. The woman touched her wrist in gratitude and moved on. Reed noticed the exchange, filed away the ease, the accuracy, the absence of pride. By the time they reached the terminal, the distance between them had turned from aisle width to question mark. The boy woke, blinking, confused, then soothed by a whispered French, "Presque là." Almost there. Reed hadn't realized he'd stopped walking until Camille had to sidestep him. "Tomorrow," he said. It came out closer to please than he'd intended. "I don't own a suit," she answered, not quite a refusal. "I don't require uniforms," he said. "Just truth." They stood in the draft from the automatic doors, the air swapping temperature like a trick. Practicalities reasserted themselves with New England bluntness. Bus schedules, daycare hours, money that had to go 3 places before it got anywhere near a cab. She tucked the card into the pocket of a coat that had seen too many winters. He watched her fold the stroller down with one hand while balancing a backpack and a sleeping child with the other, an everyday miracle he felt unaccountably unqualified to witness. "Why me?" she asked finally, because even the brave buy time in questions. "Because you corrected something no one else knew needed correcting," he said, "and you didn't do it to be noticed." She inhaled as if the air itself might hold an answer. It didn't. The sliding doors exhaled cold. A bus sighed at the curb. She stepped toward it and then stopped, turning back with the wryness of someone who still expects life to hackle at her temerity. "If I come and I'm wrong for it," she said, "I won't stay out of politeness. If you come and you're wrong for it," he said, "it will be because the room is wrong for you." For a second they saw how ridiculous and dignifying that sounded, and the smile that passed between them was the first unguarded thing they had shared. She lifted Noah into the bus. Reed stayed on the sidewalk, laptop case feeling suddenly ornamental in his hand. The bus door closed and reopened because a shoe had failed to clear. It closed again. The vehicle pulled away, murmuring through slush. He raised a hand to wave and didn't, because he didn't know if he had that right. She didn't look back because she had a son to steady. Both of them pretended the small ache that followed was just weather. On the ride into the city, Camille rested her cheek against the crown of Noah's head and watched Boston unscroll in a grammar of brick and steam. She had heard a tone in the man's voice she did not associate with the rich, the tone of someone willing to be wrong in public. She had also heard something else, an invitation so spare it could be mistaken for a dare. At a stoplight, a woman on the sidewalk scolded her dog in German. The dog ignored her in any language. A street musician played a chord progression that tried to be French and almost made it. Over the river, the wind shoved the January sky around until it gave up and went still. Camille touched the pocket where the card nestled like a small, hot stone. "Tomorrow," she told the window, then corrected herself in Turkish, because hope sometimes needs to dress differently in the dark. Tomorrow came the way it always does, honest, unadorned, on time. In the hour before she had to choose, she walked the perimeter of Copley Square to keep from deciding too fast. The cold needled her hands until they burned back warm. Her phone buzzed with a voicemail from the speech clinic. Noah's session canceled again. She listened twice, not for the news but for the apology that never arrived. She opened her messages and typed a note to herself in Spanish that translated, roughly, Someone opened a door. Don't apologize for walking through it. At 9:27, she crossed Boylston toward the hotel whose lobby smelled expensive enough to flinch. A doorman opened the glass. She stepped into a room that thought it was important. The receptionist glanced up. Ms. Doyle? A neat smile. You're expected. Nobody said expected when you were there by accident. She waited for someone to revoke the premise, a manager to flutter out with protocols and regret. No one did. In the elevator mirror, she recognized the version of herself who had never been offered anything without a form to prove it. She almost apologized to that girl. The doors opened on the 17th floor. The corridor looked like three carpet companies trying to agree on beige. She paused at the conference room threshold, hand on the cool metal of the handle, and felt her body revert to an old habit. Translate the feeling before it translates you. Fear said, "You don't belong." Language answered, "Belong is a verb." Inside, men and women paged through binders in three languages and spoke in a fourth, the universal dialect of nerves. At the head of the table, there was an empty chair beside a stack of documents marked with Reed's sharp handwriting. She took the seat without permission because the only way to test a door is to walk through it. Somewhere below them, the city breathed. Somewhere beyond them, a trial's future waited to be argued into sense. Somewhere between them sat a boy who would need his mother at 5. Every reason to leave, every reason to stay. She set her pen on the page where French faced German and chose the most difficult language first. Silence. She would let the room speak. Then she would tell it what it had said. They didn't look up when she entered. That should have unnerved her. It steadied her instead. The 17th floor conference room had glass on two sides and a long walnut table that swallowed the view. In the center, paper, stapled bricks of it, laid out in parallel columns of English, French, and German, with a thinner packet in Turkish offset like a quiet afterthought. Camille slipped into the empty chair at Reed's left. He didn't introduce her or pause the room to explain. He only turned a page and slid a capped pen within reach, as if offering a compass to someone who'd already chosen a direction. "Let's begin," said a man across from her, German vowels planed smooth by years of international travel. "Procurement sequencing, then ethics board interfaces, then regional deviations." He didn't ask if anyone was missing. Camille let the first 5 minutes wash through her, accent maps, power lines, who spoke to prove they were needed and who didn't speak because they were. The pages under her fingers smelled faintly of toner and hurry. She made her first mark not in English but in French, underlining essay in a clause that framed the study's purpose. In the margin she wrote etude, small and certain. Reed's head angled a fraction. He didn't speak, but his attention moved like a light over to her side of the table. "Why?" he murmured, pitched for her alone. Essay hints at something experimental, provisional, she said softly. Etude situates the work in a clinical context. Patients hear the difference. Regulators do too. She didn't add. Words have gravity. Pick the mass, you mean. The man to Reed's right, Daniel according to the name Tent, flicked a pen once, a tiny metronome of skepticism. "Legal approved that phrasing," he said without looking up. "Legal approved it for France 3 years ago," Camille replied, still quiet, still looking at the page. "The guidance that followed changed how it lands." Someone at the far end coughed, not from a cold. Reed made no comment, only drew a bracket along the paragraph and wrote a single barbed note. "Revise procedee." They moved on. A French delegate cleared his throat to object to a procurement term. He felt flattered, the wrong vendor. A Turkish paragraph misused an agglutinative construction that changed who was consenting to what. Camille circled, dotted, lightly rewove. No grandstanding, no throat-clearing preface, just a series of small, precise repairs that altered the scaffolding beneath the talk. Then the first real wall appeared. "We cannot accept multinational oversight in Budapest," said a man with blue-flecked eyes and an accent that landed in Eastern Europe and made no apology for it. "Hungarian statute bars foreign audit panels on joint biomedical studies. This is non-negotiable." Silence drew itself thin. Daniel sat forward, knuckles ghosting the wood. Reed waited, his face as unreadable as a closed book. Camille felt the reflex that had once kept her safe, shrink until vanished. She did the opposite. She leaned slightly into the table. In January, she said, Act TLIV was amended. There's a clause, transitional, nested in the footnotes, that allows foreign audit participation for joint studies if they're registered with the National Public Health Center. The blue-eyed man's chin lifted. You are certain. She had already opened the statute on her phone, not to prove she could, but because she liked to be precise. Page 37, paragraph 3. The Hungarian text is careful. It doesn't grant the world permission, just a narrow corridor for cross-border oversight. If we walk it exactly, we're inside the law. He blinked, and a knuckles worth of hostility turned into a fingertips worth of interest. How did you... I read footnotes, she said, almost apologetic. Reed didn't applaud or nod. He turned back to the blue-eyed man with the same even tone he used for contracts and triage. Shall we proceed then? The air in the room unstuck. Someone exhaled and pretended they hadn't been holding their breath. The conversation resumed, now with a small seam added, respect, stitched so thin you'd miss it if you didn't know how to feel fabric. Camille kept working. Here a French prise en charge that needed to be prise en soin. There a German Betreuung that should be behandling in context. She flagged an English subject that should become participant, not to placate, but because participation implies agency, and agency modifies outcomes not just ethically, but statistically. Language was not the wrapping around the work. It was the work skeleton, hidden until it broke. Halfway through the second deck, a bottle of water slid across the table until it kissed her notebook. She hadn't asked. Reed didn't look at her. He just moved the bottle from his side to hers, the way you add a log to a fire you intend to keep. When the first section recessed, Daniel stacked his papers into perfect 90-degree corners and finally addressed her directly. Your role? It lacked question marks. I'm here to keep your meaning intact, she said, neither deferential nor proud. We have vendors for that. You have vendors for word-by-word exchange. I'm here for the part money can't buy, the difference between what we write and what people hear. His mouth pressed thin. Who invited you? I did, Reed said, not unkindly. He still didn't look at either of them. He turned to the next agenda line and kept the room moving like a conductor who prefers the orchestra forgets he's there. She felt heat rise under her coat, not embarrassment, something like exposure, a sun she wasn't used to standing beneath. She forced her attention back into the fibers of text, where she always knew what to do. In a Turkish adverse event clause, the verb form suggested an ongoing harm when the intention was a discrete event. She changed the suffix, and with it, the ethics. By the third hour, the table sounded different. Interruptions softened into questions. Can you check this nuance? Replaced, that's fine. The blue-eyed Hungarian leaned toward her twice. The French delegate shifted from defending to consulting. The German procurement lead, who had entered the meeting with a stack of numbered objections, numbered none of his last three. In the slack between segments, Reed's phone lit his face with a pale square. He scrolled, unreadable as ever. Camille pretended she didn't notice the way he reread certain lines as if measuring them against something invisible. It occurred to her that this, not the money or the planes, might be what power actually felt like when you tried it on from the inside. Not volume, not speed, just the option to pause. They broke for 10 minutes. People migrated to coffee urns and skyline windows. Camille stayed in her seat, drawing a line down a page to separate the land she'd already surveyed from the territory still unmapped. The chair beside her shifted. She looked up. Reed had sat again, closer by an inch she hadn't expected. You came, he said, not as triumph or gratitude, but as a fact he found surprisingly moving. I said I might. You said nothing, he corrected mildly, but you were considering. I've learned to hear that. She glanced at the bottle, half empty now, bead of condensation tracking a slow path. You don't introduce me, she said, not accusing, not complaining. On purpose. Names are cheap. Proof is expensive, he said. I don't like to buy twice. She thought of how easily a title can be both shield and trap. It would have been easier, she admitted. He tilted his head, assessing the room through the glass. Has ease ever been what you wanted? She almost laughed. It used to be a fantasy. Now I distrust it. Good, he said. Ease makes people sloppy. Precision saves lives. He let that sit, then added with an odd gentleness, You saved us a year in Budapest today. She deflected the compliment to where it belonged. Hungary saved itself with a narrow doorway. I just didn't pretend it was a wall. The next session began with a video conference line crackling a Swiss liaison into being. Questions came harder now, the kind that hid answers behind culture rather than logic. Camille rewound idiom into intent, swapped a German dürfen for können to keep permission from masquerading as capacity, and once, when a French phrase tried to put responsibility in the passive voice, she moved it back into the hands of those who would actually hold it. The liaison, who hadn't looked at her name on the participant list, began to call her Madame Doyle. Not mockery, not quite respect. The space between. When at last the final binder closed with the tired clap of paper surrendering to time, the room thinned, chairs scraped, people made their ritual goodbyes in 4 languages plus the universal one of relieved small talk. Camille waited, not because she didn't know where to go, but because she had learned that leaving last costs nothing and buys you everything worth hearing. Only Reed and the view remained. He stood by the glass, Boston winter reduced to quiet geometry below him. She gathered her notes. He didn't turn when he spoke. You came without RSVPing. She let the smallest breath out. I didn't know if I belonged. Now he turned. The distance between his words and his eyes, which had been disciplined all morning, narrowed. You corrected international statute mid-meeting, and no one questioned you, he said. That isn't a trick of timing. No thank you, no flattery. She preferred it. Compliments you can wave away. Certainty asks you to answer. He stepped closer, not into her space, just enough to mean the next sentence. I need someone who can do what you did before a misunderstanding becomes an injury, he said. Not just to our contracts, to people. She felt the old doubts try to lace their boots. You are here by accident. You will be discovered and returned to your rightful size. She watched them tug on their laces and shook her head at them gently, the way you do with children who try to sneak into a room they are already in. What I did today was 100 small things anyone could do if they paid attention, she said. They didn't, he said. You did. Silence again. But this time it had warmth in it. He didn't hand her a job description. He didn't promise anything at all. He simply reached into his jacket, not for a contract, but for a thin rectangle. He placed it on the table between them and left his hand on it for a second longer than necessary, as if weighing the paper into the wood. She didn't flip it, not yet. She looked at him instead. I have a meeting next week, he said. Different city, same problem. Language pretending not to be the story. The corner of his mouth made something like a rueful admission. We can talk later if you like. Or not. I don't barter with need. There it was again. The invitation so spare, it could be mistaken for air. She slid the card toward herself the way you claim a future. Without spectacle, with intent. He picked up his notepad. Good work, he said, which coming from him sounded less like praise and more like a contract between equals. He turned to the door and paused as if remembering something that mattered more than schedules. He faced her fully. Drink water, he said, and that made her smile in spite of herself. After he left, she finally turned the card over. No title, a hotel name, a time, nothing else. She pressed it once against her palm and tucked it into the inner pocket of her coat, close to heat. On her way out, the receptionist looked up as if she'd been waiting for a verdict. Camille gave her a tiny nod that felt like the opposite of asking permission. Outside, the cold met her with both hands. She tightened her coat, checked the hour, and began walking toward the train that would take her to Noah. As the wind found every seam, she said aloud, to no one and to herself, belong is a verb. Then she laughed softly and translated it, French, then Turkish, then Spanish, until the meaning stopped feeling like an argument and started feeling like home. The morning after the meeting felt unreal, too ordinary for how everything had shifted. Camille woke to the metallic hum of Boston traffic outside the apartment window. Her son, Noah, was still asleep, one hand curled against his cheek, a watercolor of dreams across his forehead. She let herself look at him for a long time. Children slept like they trusted the world. Adults envied that. The card Reed had given her sat on the nightstand. Cream stock, thick enough to suggest permanence, empty enough to demand choice. Zurich, Thursday, 10 a.m. No title, no company name. Just coordinates, as if he assumed she'd understand that direction alone was enough. She should have dismissed it. It wasn't a contract, barely even an offer. She could have told herself it was an eccentric billionaire's whim, an impulsive gesture on a plane he'd forget by next week. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about how he'd said, "Bring your son." People didn't say that. Not in her world. By Tuesday, she'd half convinced herself she wasn't going. By Wednesday, she'd already checked Noah's passport expiration date twice. By Thursday morning, she was on a flight over the Atlantic with a small backpack, a single suitcase, and an email from Reed's assistant she hadn't requested. "Your car will meet you at arrivals. Child accommodations confirmed." The Zurich air was thin and cold enough to sting. A driver in a dark coat waited with a discreet sign. No company logo, just Doyle. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Her reflection in the car window looked like someone halfway between belonging and trespassing. The Langston Biotech satellite office sat on Bahnhofstrasse, where the old city's cobblestones met the glass of modern ambition. Inside, 12 people waited around a table, too expensive for comfort. None of them looked up when she entered. A man near the head of the table, Daniel Koenig, head of European strategy, adjusted his tie, glanced at her hands, noted the absence of a briefcase. "We were told someone from legal would join," he said, voice polite as a scalpel. "But I assume your operations?" Camille gave a small nod. "Something like that." "Excellent," he said, in the tone of someone who meant the opposite. The meeting began in 4 languages. German dominated, French intruded politely. English filled the gaps. She listened, absorbing cadence before meaning, hearing where certainty cracked and where pride made syntax brittle. They spoke of biomarkers, transitional law, data custody. When Daniel outlined a proposal referencing an EU clause she knew had expired, she hesitated only long enough to breathe. "That provision was replaced in March," she said evenly. "Under the Swiss EU transitional framework, biomarker clearance now falls under Article 27b. The wording you're using hasn't applied since February." Koenig blinked. "And you are?" "Camille Doyle." "And your role?" Before she could answer, the door opened. Reed entered. No briefcase, no entourage, just quiet inevitability. He had that kind of presence that rearranged a room without asking permission. "She's the reason we didn't lose Ancora," he said simply, moving toward his chair. "If you're still waiting for titles, you've already missed the point." He sat beside her, not across, not above, beside. Leaning slightly toward her, he switched to German. "You all right?" She matched his tone in the same language. "Yes, but they don't understand what I'm doing here." "That's fine," he murmured in English now, loud enough for the room. "They'll understand by the end." A pulse of silence followed, and then the conversation resumed, but softer now, recalibrated around her presence. Camille didn't gloat. She simply worked. When Koenig stumbled over an English phrasing of compliance oversight, she offered a correction in French that clarified both legal and emotional nuance. When a translator misread Verordnung as instruction instead of regulation, she quietly amended it. Every adjustment was surgical, precise, unemotional, irrefutable. By mid-afternoon, even Koenig stopped questioning her interjections. After the session, she stood by the window overlooking the trams. The late sun caught in the glass. She could see her reflection and his behind it. Reed, scrolling his phone, expression unreadable. "You came," he said, as if confirming something he'd been half afraid to hope for. "You sent a ticket," she replied. He pocketed his phone and crossed the space between them. "That wasn't the only thing I sent. Did you get the note?" She frowned. "What note?" "Then it's still on its way." He handed her a folder. No logo, no preface. Inside was a single page, one line printed in dark ink. "I want you to be the voice that reviews every word before the world sees it." Camille stared at the page. "Why me?" "Because you hear when language lies," he said. "That's not a qualification." He met her eyes. "It's the only one I trust." Something in his tone unsettled her. Too sincere for manipulation, too quiet for flattery. She closed the folder carefully as if it contained something fragile. And if I say no, then you'll still have been the only one to tell me the truth this week. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Noah's fine, he said. He's been reading about alpine animals in 3 languages. She blinked. You checked? I always check. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. Later that night, she sat on the hotel balcony while snow fell over Zurich like ash from a slow fire. Noah was asleep, a picture book splayed across his chest. She opened her laptop to find an email flagged urgent. Subject: Langston Zurich Protocols Review. Clarification required. Her presence was not formally approved. Please confirm scope of access. No sender's name. No signature. But the phrasing, formally approved, scope of access, belonged unmistakably to Daniel Koenig. For a moment, fear pulsed in her throat. She wasn't a staff member. She had no title, no authority. She could be erased with a single memo. But then she remembered the folder Reed had given her, the note written in his own sharp hand. Your review matters more than their approval. She closed the email without replying. The next morning, she walked into the office without a badge. Reed had overridden the system. Her name appeared automatically on the access list. Koenig looked up from his desk, surprise flickering behind practiced neutrality. Miss Doyle, he said, too calm, you don't usually check in here. I don't, she said, but you sent a message. He blinked. I don't believe It wasn't signed, she interrupted, but it used your words. Formally approved. Scope of access. I know how you write. He stood, lips parting, searching for diplomatic cover. We are a regulatory division. We follow process. So do I, she said, stepping closer. That's why Ancora didn't collapse. That's why the Zurich documents weren't thrown out last week, because I read the clause your legal team missed. He exhaled through his nose, faintly annoyed, faintly impressed. I'm not asking for a title, she continued, and I don't care if you like how I got here. But if you undermine my role again without addressing me directly, I'll make sure that correction is your last edit on file. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Authority, she learned, was best spoken in the same tone as fluency. Koenig stared for a long moment before sitting back down. Understood. Camille turned to go, but at the door she paused. One more thing, she said, quieter now. I wasn't formally invited to my first meeting either. Mr. Langston just left the door open. The look on his face was worth nothing and everything. That night, when she returned to her suite, an envelope waited under the door. Inside, a single sheet printed in 5 languages, a Langston policy draft. At the bottom, in black ink, your review matters more than their approval. Our Camille folded the paper slowly. Outside, Zurich glowed like a city mid-conversation. Half old, half new, all translation. She sat by Noah's bed and traced the outline of his tiny hand with her finger, whispering an old Turkish proverb her grandmother had once said, "A single thread of silk can hold more weight than a chain if tied at the right time." She looked again at Reed's handwriting and felt for the first time that she might finally be learning when to tie the knot. The next morning, Zurich sharpened itself to a colder edge. Trams stitched the city in patient lines, and the lake wore a skin of light that made people squint. Camille walked Noah to the childcare suite the hotel had arranged. Bright rugs, multilingual picture books, a soft-voiced attendant who greeted him in French and switched to English when he tugged at her sleeve. He didn't cry. He looked up at Camille and said, "See you afterwards," the way some children say, after lunch. She kissed his hair and thought, yes, afterwards. That had become the shape of their days. At the Langston office, she found a room already warmed by the friction of disagreement. A Swiss liaison sat on screen, neat as a diagram. Daniel Koenig marked his papers with slashing diagonals, the graphite equivalent of impatience. Procurement leads exchanged the courteous hostilities of people who had worked together long enough to forget formality and not long enough to earn forgiveness. Before we begin, Koenig said, a point of process. We will adhere to formal roles. Questions go through legal. Translation is advisory. Advisory, a word that meant, we can ignore you if pride requires it. No one looked at Reed. He was already seated, pen still, attention in the air between people, rather than on any one person's face. "Begin," he said, and the room obeyed. The Swiss liaison launched into Article 27b with the rhythm of someone who lived inside footnotes. The clause allowed biomarker clearance under a transitional framework, one paragraph, three subclauses, an innocuous footnote that rearranged accountability like furniture. As the liaison spoke, rhythm and meaning began to drift apart. German verbs stacked at the end of sentences like delayed freight, English summaries flattened nuance, French recaps softened what should have stayed sharp. And so the Oversight Committee may assume capacity for authorization, the liaison concluded. "Permission," Camille said before she could stop herself. "Not capacity." She kept her voice level, almost conversational. "DARF is not can. The text gives permission to authorize. It does not assume ability." The liaison paused mid-breath, a small and human stutter. "Yes," he said finally, tipping his head. "Permission." Koenig's pencil made a line long enough to cut the page. "Noted," he said. He did not look at her, which was better than the alternative. They moved into adverse event reporting obligations. A French paragraph drifted toward the passive voice. Harms occurred, reports were filed, responsibility evaporated. Camille circled three verbs and pulled them back into the hands of the people meant to carry them. "Patients are not a weather pattern," she said softly. "The grammar should stop pretending harm falls from the sky." Someone at the far end, German procurement, square shoulders, square jaw, exhaled a laugh he didn't mean to give. It broke the room's tension by a millimeter. The liaison then introduced a compromise meant to soothe Swiss pride. A bilingual annex where the German text would govern if discrepancies arose. It sounded harmless. It wasn't. "That annex creates asymmetry," Camille said, finding herself speaking before anyone could praise the elegance of the solution. "You can't promise equivalence and then crown a language. It makes the English a draft forever." "German is the controlling language of Swiss regulation," Koenig said, finally looking at her. "This is not an affront." "It's a hierarchy," she replied, "and it will leak in other directions." She flipped pages to the consent form. Here, where the English states the family's right to withdraw in unequivocal terms, the German uses a formulation that allows institutional persuasion. If the annex governs, you have a problem you won't notice until a mother refuses and someone tells her she can't. "This is a hypothetical," a voice offered down the table. "This is a Tuesday," Camille said, blunt now, not out of irritation but urgency. "Language becomes policy the moment it crosses a threshold and meets a person." Silence bloomed the way it sometimes does when the simplest sentence is the most inconvenient. The liaison leaned closer to his camera. "What do you propose?" She didn't hesitate. "Parallel texts that cross-check for power. Anywhere control can creep, we mirror terms so neither version can smuggle preference past the other. And we add a reconciliation clause that names intent, not just governance. We state explicitly that participant autonomy, as defined in both texts, prevails in the event of ambiguity." There was a beat where even paper seemed to stop rustling. Then Reed said, "Do it." Koenig's eyes flicked to him. "That's not standard." "Neither," Reed replied, "is pretending words don't move people." His tone didn't rise, it clarified. He looked to Camille, and for the first time since Boston, he made something public. "Ms. Doyle will review every line of the bilingual annexes and the reconciliation clause. Her mark governs language, pending legal." Pending legal, not overridden, an elegant respect, an unmistakable assignment of authority. A few chins lifted, the way people brace when they realize an order has been given without drama. They pressed on. Procurement tried to tuck an exclusivity clause into a footnote, like a child hiding contraband under a bed. Camille dragged it back into daylight. "This binds the institution to a vendor for 12 months beyond trial termination. If your data says a competitor's device performs better, you'll be contractually obligated to ignore it." She let that sit. "You don't want a clause that makes you fluent in regret." By midday, she could feel the shape of resistance changing. It had started with affront. It had become attention. People who planned to dismiss her were now saving questions for her. This wasn't victory. It was an environment. During a pause, Reed slid a small stack of paper in front of her, draft language he'd scribbled in dark ink. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain. She read and felt the oddest sensation. Someone else had built her a bridge, and it held. Intent prevails. She tapped those two words. This will survive translation. Will it survive lawyers? Koenig asked dry. If it doesn't, Reed said, we need different lawyers. The liaison, whose English had crisped as the call went on, said on the screen, Madam Doyle, would you please propose the exact phrasing for this reconciliation clause in German and English for our legal to assess? She nodded, already writing. She kept the German muscular where the English softened and preserved the English clarity where the German could balloon. For 10 minutes, the table watched her transform air into ink. She read the draft aloud finally, first in English, then in German. No one interrupted. When she finished, the liaison smiled without showing teeth. Respect, European edition. That will do, he said. Send. They broke for lunch, but no one moved, as if they feared leaving might break the new surface tension. When people finally stood, the room rearranged itself around her. 2 questions here, a quiet request there. Koenig approached last. You present corrections as inevitable, he said. It's difficult to argue with inevitability. She capped her pen. I present meaning as non-negotiable, she said. It's difficult to argue that words shouldn't mean what we say. He studied her. You are not legal. You are not operations. He seemed almost curious. What are you? The first person who will be blamed if the language fails, she said. So I prefer that it doesn't. For the first time he smiled. Not wide enough. Understood. In the afternoon, a harder thing arrived. A parent advocacy group patched into the call for a scheduled 15 minutes, used 30. A woman's voice, French with the rust of cigarettes and grief, pushed back on institutional timelines and euphemisms. The room stiffened. Defensiveness is fluent in every language. Camille listened to the verbs the woman chose. Carry, fight, sleep, wake, wait. She waited until the woman's sentences began to run out of air. In the documents, Camille said, addressing the woman directly and switching into French, we will stop calling your consent an authorization. We will call it what it is, a decision. The phrase you are permitted will become you choose. Where the forms mention subjects, we will use participants, and where the forms say monitoring, we will write care. If any of this reads like we are doing this to you instead of with you, you will tell me, and I will change it. Silence, then softly, et qui êtes-vous? Someone whose child needs the world to mean what it says, Camille answered. Not a lie, even if Noah's needs were not this. The woman drew a breath you could hear through the speaker and said, Merci. When the call ended, some of the men in the room looked at the table as if it had complicated itself. At 4, the drafts updated on the shared screen. Track changes bled the page with the proof of their day. Camille's initials appeared like quiet signatures where it mattered most. Reed leaned back, finally, and closed his eyes for one measured second. When he opened them, he looked at Koenig. We're standardizing this across all regions, he said. Parallel text, reconciliation clause, intent prevails. Ms. Doyle oversees. There it was. Not advisory, not accidental, policy. Koenig didn't resist. He simply wrote, Understood. When the meeting adjourned, the room didn't empty so much as it exhaled. People left in 2s, then 1s. Camille stayed, gathering papers into piles that made sense only to her. She felt the pleasant exhaustion that follows a clean fight. You changed the room, Reed said from the window, not turning, without making it about you. It was never about me, she said, sliding the cap back onto her pen. It's about the people who will live with the words after we've gone home. He faced her fully. That's why I'm asking you to look at all of them, he said. Everything with our name on it, before the world sees it. You asked that yesterday, she reminded him, trying for lightness and landing closer to reverent. In writing. I'm asking it now where others can hear, he said, and indeed Koenig, still at the door, paused, a witness to the formalization of what had been decided in ink. Camille didn't say thank you. She didn't know how to receive gratitude for being trusted to do the thing she had always known how to do. Instead, she said, drink water, because he forgets, and he laughed, an unarmored sound she hadn't heard before. At the childcare suite, Noah greeted her with triumph. He could name 3 alpine animals in German now, though the ibex insisted on being French. On the walk back to the hotel, snow sketched the air in thin, deliberate lines. Noah's hand was small in hers, warm and certain. In the quiet of the room, an envelope waited under the door. Inside, the 5-language policy draft again, updated, the reconciliation clause now part of it, her phrasing intact. At the bottom, in Reed's black ink, 3 words and a period. Intent prevails. She sat on the bed and let the words take their full weight. Intent prevails. In documents. In rooms. Between people. Noah crawled into her lap. "After words?" he asked. "After words," she said, and kissed his hair. Across the hall, a door shut softly. She could almost hear Reed's careful steps, the way he moved as if the room might bruise if he wasn't deliberate. Tomorrow would bring more clauses, more annexes, more people who used language the way some people used armor. Tonight, she let the city's many tongues braid themselves into a lullaby she didn't have to translate. She turned off the lamp and thought of the narrow corridors in law, the ones that look like walls until you know where to press. Somewhere along the day, a rule had bent toward mercy because a word had been forced to tell the truth. A single thread of silk tied at the right time. The message arrived without a greeting, just a subject line that hummed with quiet malice. Clarification required. Camille read it twice. The way you read a foreign word you're sure you've seen before. The sender's address was masked under the corporate routing string, but she knew the cadence. Each phrase deliberate, each noun heavy. Daniel Koenig. Her role was not formally authorized within Zurich operations. Please clarify the scope of her access moving forward. She sat still for a long moment, the city outside her window reflecting in the laptop screen like another version of herself. One made of light, not bone. Then she closed the message and stood. The Langston office was already awake when she arrived. Zurich's morning light didn't ease into rooms. It declared itself. Reed wasn't there yet. Koenig was. Sharp suit, colder smile. "Miss Doyle," he said, voice smooth as granite. "I didn't expect you so early." "I prefer to start before people decide who owns the day," she replied. His mouth twitched, almost a smirk. "We have protocols for security access. I assumed you'd prefer clarity." "Clarity's useful," she said. "So is respect." He gestured toward the glass wall as though framing the view of the river could soften the edge in his words. "You're talented, no one disputes that. But there's a process to integration, and bypassing it is what saved you last week," she finished quietly. "Your legal draft would have invalidated the trial under EU transitional law. You didn't notice because your translation software dropped a qualifier." He blinked, a small defensive reflex. "You make it sound intentional." "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "Just careless. That's worse." For a heartbeat, the room was all silence and glass. Then he leaned forward, tone clipped. "You have no title here, Miss Doyle. Titles matter in Europe. This isn't America where talent alone lets you walk into the boardroom." Camille picked up a binder from the desk, flipped to a tab he'd signed yesterday, and slid it toward him. "Then perhaps you should explain why this section, your section, still refers to non-EU trial sites as subsidiaries. That word has legal implications that invalidate data transfer compliance." Koenig froze. She didn't smile. "If you want to talk about titles, Daniel, make sure yours still means something after the regulators read this." He exhaled through his nose, the way people do when they've lost but refuse to call it that. "I see," he said finally. "You're not just a linguist." "No," she said softly. "I'm the person who keeps your meaning from burning down the building." Then she turned and left the room. That afternoon, Reed returned from Geneva and found her in the translation bay, hair tied up, sleeves rolled, hands covered in annotation ink. "You look like you've been fighting," he said. "I have," she answered. Politely. He dropped a folder beside her. "I assume Koenig finally sent something stupid in writing." She raised an eyebrow. "You knew?" "I hired him for precision, not imagination. He confuses hierarchy with order." She sat back. "He's trying to box me in, formalize access, limit my scope. I think he's hoping I'll refuse and leave." Reed nodded once, then opened the folder. Inside was a clean draft of the Zurich Operational Charter. Her name appeared in the footnotes of 3 sections, not as translator, but as review authority. "You're already written in," he said, "legally." She blinked. "That's impossible. I'm not employed here." "You're engaged," he corrected. "Temporarily, but with review privileges equivalent to a department head. I signed it this morning." "Without approval?" "With intent," he said. "The rest can catch up." For a long moment she didn't speak. The gesture was audacious, even reckless. But beneath it was something she hadn't realized she needed. Belief. "You'll make enemies doing this," she warned. "I already have," he said dryly. "I just prefer to pick them carefully." Then, almost as an afterthought, "Did Noah like the zoo?" She blinked, startled. "You remembered?" "I asked the concierge to schedule it." "Why?" "Because you work better when you're not worried about him," Reed said simply. "And because I wanted to see if you'd notice I was paying attention." She didn't answer. Some acknowledgments didn't need words. That night, Zurich folded itself into a hush of snow and neon. Camille sat on the hotel bed with the contract spread before her. Reed's signature ran across the bottom in precise black strokes. Elegant, final. Beneath it, a short note handwritten in the margin. "Your review matters more than their approval. AR." She stared at the line until it blurred. The next morning, the war changed tactics. A new message appeared on her internal feed, anonymous but familiar in tone. "Some of us are concerned about your unorthodox influence on regulatory documentation. It may compromise objectivity." Camille read it, smiled faintly, and forwarded it directly to Reed with no comment. 10 minutes later, Koenig appeared at her door, face pale, voice tight. "You escalated that?" "I didn't escalate anything," she said. "I just believe in transparency." "You made me look foolish." "No," she said calmly. "You did that yourself. I just translated it." Reed arrived behind him, hands in pockets, expression unreadable. "Daniel," he said, voice even, "we hired Ms. Doyle because she knows the cost of the wrong word. You've now demonstrated the cost of the right one ignored." Koenig opened his mouth, then closed it. "Understood," he said finally, and left. When the door clicked shut, Reed looked at Camille. "You didn't flinch." "I wanted to," she said. "Good," he replied. "Fear means you care. Indifference means you're done." She tilted her head. "And what about you? Do you still care, or are you just playing chess with people's pride?" Reed smiled faintly. "Maybe both." "Honest," she said. "I try," he said. "But I like that you ask." Later that week, Camille found a new envelope slid under her door. This one wasn't official. No header, no seal. Just a folded page in Reed's handwriting. Zurich was never about translation. It was about trust. "Geneva next week. Bring Noah. The meeting's short." "The day doesn't have to be." She sat back, the words pulling warmth through her like sunlight under ice. She looked across the room at Noah, coloring in a book on the carpet, tongue peeking out in concentration. "We might take another trip," she said. "Somewhere with trains?" he asked. "Yes," she said, smiling. "And people who think in many languages." He looked up. "Like you." She laughed softly. "Maybe." When he went back to his drawing, she whispered the Turkish proverb again, half to herself. "A thread of silk holds more than a chain if tied at the right time." This was the moment she realized. She'd tied it. The next day, Koenig found her in the corridor, carrying a stack of freshly printed documents. "Miss Doyle," he said, stopping her. She waited. "I owe you," he said quietly, "for the revisions. The liaison approved them this morning." She studied his face. No sarcasm, no angle. "You don't owe me," she said. "Just keep the words clean." He nodded once. "I'll try." When he was gone, she caught Reed watching from his office doorway. He didn't smile. He only lifted a brow as if to ask, "You see now?" She did. Power wasn't volume or wealth. It was precision. A word used rightly could move continents. That evening, as snow drifted over the Zurich roofs, Reed walked her to the hotel lobby. Neither spoke at first. Then he said, "You've changed the way they speak in that building." "I just translated what they were trying to say," she replied. "No," he said. "You made them mean it." At the elevator, she turned to him. "Geneva," she said. "Is it business?" He hesitated. "Not exactly." "Then what?" "You'll see," he said. And when the elevator doors closed between them, she realized that what had begun as language had become something quieter, riskier, something she couldn't edit. Back in her room, she found one more slip of paper waiting on the desk, folded twice. Reed's handwriting again. Intent prevails. Below it, 3 smaller words, written almost like an afterthought. So does trust. She didn't know yet if he meant the company, the contract, or something far more personal. But as she turned off the light and listened to Noah's breathing, even out in the dark, she knew this much. Whatever was happening next, she'd stopped waiting to be invited. She was already inside the room. Geneva didn't announce itself the way Zurich did. It unspooled. Lake first, then a confusion of winter light and tram bells, a softer city stitched with water and breath. The hotel was old enough to creak in the right places. Their rooms faced each other across a narrow hall, not conjoined, not distant, close like conversation. Reed had sent the message the night before. Bare as a bone. Not business. Bring Noah. The meeting's short. The day doesn't have to be. It was the last sentence she trusted. The door to not business was small. Most people never found it once the other door swung wide. She dressed Noah in layers and a stubborn little hat and tried not to name what the day could be. Morning found them at a cafe with red chairs that stood out like punctuation. Reed was already there. No laptop, no papers, a concession tray of toast and a small jar of apricot jam, waiting untouched as if he'd been rehearsing restraint. Noah climbed into the chair beside him, the way children do when they've already added you to their internal map. The waitress looked pleased with them, without knowing why. Some tables are easy to serve. They didn't talk business. Reed set that down like a heavy instrument he refused to carry into this room. Instead, they talked about language the way other people talk about weather, what it did to them, how it changed what they wore. He said in German there's a word, Sehnsucht, for a longing shaped like a place you haven't been yet. Camille replied that in French, manquer makes missing an action that happens to you. It's not I miss you, it's you are missing to me. Reed considered that for a long time, as if it might be an answer he needed for another question. Noah, intent on the jam, narrated the world in small verbs. Spread, he said with the solemnity of a ceremony. Taste. He offered the knife handle to Reed with the trust of someone who has learned already when adults will keep him safe. Reed took it like an oath. You don't say much when it matters, Camille said finally, when the silence between them had filled and emptied twice. You set the table and let the words show up if they want to. I was raised in noise, Reed said. It made me suspicious of volume. He didn't elaborate. He had given her the architecture of a childhood in one line and left the windows uncurtained. They walked after breakfast, holding the day by its quiet edges. The lake carried a pallor that made everything look like a memory of itself. A street musician played a song that wanted to be French and settled for hopeful. Reed and Noah argued gently about the name of an unfamiliar bird until Camille solved it with her phone and a delighted corrective in German that made Noah beam and Reed feign defeat. Do you ever get tired of translating? He asked as they crossed to a street lined with small shops. Language? She shook her head. No. Exhausted by people who use it as a shield, yes. But words themselves? They're just tools. She paused, then amended. And sometimes ropes. Ropes? To pull someone closer, or to lower them down safely, or to tie something worth saving until you can come back for it. She smiled. I like ropes. He watched her for a second longer than necessary, and then, rare, unguarded, looked away first. The bookstore they found was narrow and deep, the kind of place that teaches you to whisper whether you meant to or not. A brass bell announced them like a memory of a door. Shelves leaned under the weight of languages that had agreed to coexist. Noah made for a table of picture books as if pulled by a string tied to his small sternum, and returned with one in Korean, triumphant because this was new. Will you try? Reed asked, chin tipping toward the hangul on the first page. Camille read the opening line, careful, respectful. It wasn't perfect, but her mouth learned quickly, and the second sentence landed with a music that made the shopkeeper lift her eyes. Reed didn't know the words, but he knew the sound of meaning when it cleared a room. "We could stay here," he said, half to himself, half to the wood and paper. "In a place where everything has to be chosen twice, once with your eyes, once with your mouth." "We could," she agreed, "but the world would still be outside asking for a translation." They drifted to the back wall where postcards were tacked in a tiled grid. 1,000 small summonses with quotes in uneven fonts. Noah selected one with a cat wearing a solemn bow tie. Reed reached for a card from the middle row and paused, smiling like a man caught by fate committing a small kindness. He passed the card to Camille. On it, in a wash of midnight blue, "Some people arrive and make such a beautiful impact. You can barely remember what life was like without them." She held his gaze a fraction longer than a quote deserves. She did not say, "Careful." She didn't have to. He had written "not business in a city where everything was." They paid with a choreography that felt practice-ready. Reed slid cash under the register tray. The shopkeeper reached for a stamp that left a tiny boat in the corner of the receipt. Noah pocketed a free bookmark as if he'd bartered for it. Outside, the winter sun pretended at warmth. They believed it enough to keep walking. At lunch, a bowl of soup made the day briefly domestic. "What would you do if it all stopped?" Reed asked, repeating the question he'd asked at the cafe when breakfast still felt like an audition. "I'd still speak," she said, "even if no one was listening, even if it was just to Noah." She considered. "Especially then." He nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd been testing. "I'd build," he said, "a smaller version of what I do now. Fewer rooms to heat, more windows." "Where?" "Somewhere the mail arrives late and it doesn't matter." He took a breath. "With the right people." She could have laughed. He hadn't said "with you," and he didn't need to. The grammar of hope had already done the work. In the afternoon, Reed's phone buzzed twice and stayed in his pocket. The second time, he silenced it without looking. She noticed because noticing was a profession and a habit. He noticed her noticing and left it alone. Trust sometimes begins exactly there, in the decision not to make a useful observation. They wandered to a park where winter had pruned everything into skeletal honesty. Noah found the only patch of unfrozen ground and invented a game that involved a leaf, 2 stones, and 3 languages. Reed sat on a bench and watched him with the still attention of a person who has learned to make room for agendas beyond his own. When Noah fell, only a little, Reed stood half an inch and sat back 2 inches, and Camille thought, "He knows the difference between letting and abandoning." "Do you ever rest?" she asked. "I don't sleep well," he said. "That's not the same thing." "Do you rest?" she repeated, and he added, "Sometimes when I'm listening." "Now?" "Now," he said, and smiled for real. Late light gathered itself like a shawl around the rooftops. They returned to the hotel, the day carrying the satisfied fatigue of a clean run. Reed stopped at his door, keys in hand, and turned the card he'd bought at the bookstore over once before passing it to her. "Souvenir," he said. She looked down, read it again, and decided not to save the moment for later. She knocked on his door that night when Noah's breathing had evened into the long parentheses of sleep. He opened it without surprise and without theater, as if the universe had finally caught up to the way it had always been arranged in his head. "I don't need another contract," she said, standing in the doorway, hands in the pockets of a sweater that had survived too many laundromats. "And I don't want promises." "I don't offer promissory notes in a language we don't speak yet," he answered, "but I won't ask you to prove what you already are." She exhaled a laugh that sounded like relief, remembering how to be laughter. "If we build anything," she said, "it can't be a room I have to be invited into." "It won't be," he said. "You'll have keys, or better, no locks." They didn't define it. They let the air do the naming. He stepped back and didn't reach for her. She stepped in and didn't ask for him. Sometimes the grammar of 2 bodies finds the same tense without instruction. Later, after the lights were low and the city performed its slow winter pulsing beyond the curtains, they sat on the small balcony in borrowed hotel blankets and watched their breath cloud and disappear. "Intent prevail," he said, quoting her own clause back to her. "In rooms, in contracts, in people," she said. "And trust?" he asked. "That one's trickier," she said. "It's not passive. It's a verb you have to conjugate daily." He nodded. Plural. Always, she said. Inside, Noah turned in his sleep, a soft sound that ended in contentment. They both paused in the way adults do when a child's noise calibrates the room's compass. Reed looked at her like a man surprised to find relief on a list he hadn't planned to make. Do you remember the first thing I said to you? He asked after a while. You moved to coach, she said. You asked to trade silence for a lullaby. I didn't know it would be a language I'd have to learn, he said. I'm not quick. You're precise, she said. I'll take that over quick. The city gave them a few more minutes. They used them like water. When she finally stood to cross the hall, he didn't ask for later, and she didn't promise it. They had already chosen a different vocabulary, one that allowed for the tense of arrival. Back in her room, she checked on Noah and found the postcard he'd bought, cat, bow tie, under his pillow like a treaty. On the desk lay another envelope, familiar hand, concise. Thank you for not naming it. R. She smiled and wrote a line on the back of the bookstore receipt and slid it under his door. Some languages are clearer without labels. She lay down and let the day replay. Not the notable moments, the card, the balcony, the almost confession, but the small ones. Apricot jam surrendered, a phone turned face down, a lake agreeing to be winter for another week. If belonging is a verb, she thought, then maybe this was how you conjugate it. I arrive. You arrive. We are here. Sleep took her, finally, the way a careful hand takes a cup, fingers around, palm steady. When morning came, it would knock with its usual hard knuckles, flights and documents, and the next room that thought it was important. She would go. She would listen. She would ask words to tell the truth in a voice that could be heard. But for now, the city breathed, and she breathed with it. And across the hall, a man who had once paid for silence had discovered what it cost to keep it, and decided at last to spend his quiet on something else. Morning in Geneva began without hurry. The snow had thinned overnight, leaving the streets glazed and gentle, the kind of quiet the city only allowed itself on Sundays. From the window of her hotel room, Camille watched the lake catch a dull light and thought how, in some languages, the word for beginning and return were the same. Noah stirred in the other bed, mumbling through sleep. When he finally blinked awake, his first word was, home? She hesitated. Soon, she said, then softer, but maybe not the same one. Reed was already in the lobby, a paper cup of coffee in hand, hair still damp from the shower. He wasn't wearing the armor of business today, no tie, no laptop, just a navy coat and the careful calm of a man trying not to read too much into his own heartbeat. I was going to knock, he said when she approached. I was going to leave a note, she replied. That sounds like us. They walked outside into a city waking up slower than they were. The air carried that half-warm smell of thawed snow and pastry. Reed led without leading, hands tucked into his pockets, while Camille let Noah skip ahead, his boots slapping the stone in cheerful rhythm. They passed the cafe with the red chairs. It was empty now, chairs stacked, yesterday folded neatly into memory. Across the street, the lake began its shimmer. Are you leaving? He asked. Yes, she said. There's work in Boston waiting. Bills, routine, the language of normal life. You could stay, he said simply. Camille smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, just the way someone does when they have rehearsed both sides of a sentence. I could, but I won't stay because someone asked me to. I'll stay only if it feels like arriving, not stopping. He looked at her, and something unspoken in him softened. You always make logic sound like poetry. Same material, she said, just different tenses. The Langston European office was quiet when they arrived later that morning for one final review. Daniel Koenig met them in the corridor, subdued, respectful in a way that was almost human now. The board approved the Zurich Clause, he said, glancing at Camille. Parallel texts, reconciliation standards, and your amendment on participant language. You've changed policy. No, she said, just its tone. He nodded once and left without further ceremony. It was enough. Reed guided her into the conference room where it had all started. The same glass walls, same table, same view, but it felt different. The air wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wanted you to see this, he said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside, new letterhead drafts for Langston Biotech's global operations. Beneath the company's name, a new line in 6 languages, all approved and identical in meaning. Every word counts. Her throat tightened. You didn't need to. I did, he said. You reminded us what language is for. She looked up. And what's it for, Reed? He took a breath. To connect, to correct, to care. Sometimes all 3 at once. No one had ever made caring sound so deliberate. Noon came quietly. Reed offered to drive them to the station, and she didn't refuse. Geneva blurred by in shades of gray and copper. The old clock tower, the river splitting the city, the children on bicycles wrapped in scarves too long for their small frames. Noah fell asleep against her arm in the back seat, his head heavy and warm. Reed glanced at him in the mirror. He trusts the world more than I ever did, he said. That's because he hasn't learned how to mistranslate it yet, she said softly. When they reached the station, she opened the car door, but didn't step out immediately. You'll keep fighting them, she asked. Always, he said, now that I know which battles are worth the cost. And if you lose, he smiled faintly, then I'll ask you to rewrite the story so it ends better. She laughed, a real one this time, light and unguarded. You'd hate that. I'd make you human. Too late, he said. Inside the station, the schedule boards flickered with destinations that sounded like poems. Milan, Lyon, Vienna, Paris. Reed carried Noah's suitcase, though he barely seemed to notice its weight. The train announced boarding in 3 languages, none of them fully right, all of them good enough. Will you tell me something? Reed asked suddenly. Depends. Was Zurich the start of something? Camille tilted her head. No, it was the translation. He studied her face like a man decoding a sacred text. And Geneva? Maybe the first sentence in a new one. Their eyes held a quiet understanding that some stories don't close. They just change tense. She touched his sleeve, light as punctuation. You know, you never actually said goodbye. I didn't plan to. Good, she said. Then we're speaking the same language. The whistle cut the air. She stepped onto the train, found their seats, pressed her palm against the window. Reed stood on the platform, hands in pockets again, shoulders squared against the wind. As the train began to move, she saw him raise one hand, not in farewell, but acknowledgement. An unfinished gesture that meant until. Zurich again, 2 weeks later. A new inbox, a flood of messages, the world resuming its noise. Camille was back in Boston, but her work now bore different weight. Memos came to her for review before publication. Contracts ran through her eyes first. Somewhere between flight paths and files, she had become what she'd once only interpreted. Essential. One night, long after Noah was asleep, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, a simple envelope in a folded page. Langston letterhead, Reed's handwriting unmistakable. You once said words can be ropes. I think you're right. I just wanted to tell you. I stopped pulling them toward control. I'm using them to hold something steady now. Thank you for tying the first knot. R. Camille stared at the page until the lines blurred again, then placed it in the same drawer as Noah's first crayon drawing and her mother's old lullaby lyrics, the sacred things that didn't need translation. She sat by the window and opened her laptop. Outside, Boston glowed with its usual, relentless purpose. But in the white rectangle of her screen, she wrote something new, an internal memo draft, simple, direct. Effective immediately, all global documents shall undergo contextual review for tone and human clarity before release. Language is not neutral, it's lived. She signed it, closed the laptop, and whispered into the dark, intent prevails. The next morning, Noah woke early and climbed into her lap, holding the Korean picture book from Geneva. Read? He asked, mischief in his eyes. She smiled, tracing the characters with her finger. Let's see what it means today. Halfway through the story, he interrupted. Mama? Yes? Are we home now? She paused. The word home shifted inside her, no longer a fixed address, but a direction you reach when language and silence agree. Yes, she said finally. I think we are. Outside, the city began another day of noise. Inside, Camille and Noah kept reading, line by line, until the words turned to music. And somewhere, in another country, a man reread an old postcard that said, "Some people arrive and make such a beautiful impact. You can barely remember what life was like without them." Reed smiled, not as a businessman, not as a savior, but as a man who had learned that some translations last longer than the languages they came from. He folded the card, set it beside a stack of new policy drafts, and looked toward the window, where the world was still writing its next sentence.